Hello there, and welcome to the Second Life Book Club. My name is Draxtor Dupre. Today we have a full house, not only in the audience but also on stage, with four amazing writers on this panel. I read four books, actually three books in prep. I got to be honest. I read three books in prep this week, so you don't have to, but I think you actually should. All these books, they deal with, to some extent, with how technology and more specifically social interaction in digital spaces like this one shape our lives in the physical realm. So I guess the Second Life Book Club is possibly the perfect place to have this conversation in avatar form, fully embodied with presence, committed to one conversation. So no multitasking, please. I will introduce our panel after the usual housekeeping notes, which I will keep very brief because we have limited time with four people and a vast subject matter. Big thanks to Strawberry Linden, who is co-producing the show on this camera. Marianne McCann, Art and Schwartzman built the venue. They built special props. Arieto Chiori builds props and other places here on the island that you can explore with the teleporter. AJ McDowell makes merch, including the coffee cups that you can grab. Kralos, out of Canada, is customizing the avatars. So she made these avatars that you see on stage, except for one, which is the duck. And that avatar was handcrafted by Silas Merlin. Stephanie Ross does the website and the images. Big thanks to the Lindens, Brett Linden Patch, all the moles. You know that this show is every Wednesday, but what you may not know is that we have several hundred people coming through here every single day. So if you bump into a noob, please be kind, recommend a book. And if you want to recommend an author, please email me at slbookclub@draxtor.com. We are booked until the end of 2021, but I will carve out some dates if an author comes that we need to have. So now let me introduce the panel, and I'll do this stage right, which is house left. I just looked that up. Here is on the very edge of the couch is a crow type avatar. That's Jenny Odell. She's an artist, a writer, an educator. She teaches. I don't know if she's currently teaching at Stanford. We'll ask her at the visiting faculty of art and art history. And she wrote a book called How to Do Nothing, which is one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2019. Make of that what you will. It's a New York Times bestseller. Hello, Jenny. How are you?
I'm great. Super happy to be here. Thanks.
And Jenny has been in Second Life for a long time, but I think she's a lapsed resident. So,
My
how,
house is in disrepair.
you still have a house?
Apparently, yeah.
Oh my God, that rent that adds up. Next to Jenny is Claire L. Evans. She's a musician with the Grammy-nominated band Yacht. She's also a contributing writer with a whole slew of publications, including Wired, Vice, Motherboard, and she's the author of Broadband, which is about the women who made the internet. And I knew absolutely nothing about this, and it's a fascinating book. Claire, thank you for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And this avatar, why did you choose this avatar with your head in the clouds?
It was something I have wanted to do for a long time. Maybe we'll talk about this during the panel, but I'm also really into multi-user domains and muds and moos. And in a past incarnation, I had a silver being with a cloud for a head as my
Oh,
mud persona. So seeing it in 3D is kind of surreal.
I have a lot of slides that I'll put up about the cave, the colossal cave adventure and stuff. I mean, it's you guys' books, they go into history. I mean, there's really I'm so clueless. I thought Second Life was the first social network that ever was. That's how uninformed I am. No, I'm a little bit. Am I kidding? All these books, by the way, are on the table here. We got rid of the physical books, so for the in-world audience, you can cam in, and all the books that we'll be talking about are here on the table on stage. Now, on the other side of me is Jonathan Lethem, also New York Times bestselling author. I counted 12 novels and a handful of short story collections. And also, John wrote a book about John Carpenter's They Live, which is one of my favorite films. And he teaches at Pomona College, where one of my heroes, Frank Zappa, took music theory classes with an Austrian teacher. That is a true story. You can look it up. And also, I believe David Foster Wallace, who I also admire very much, also taught there. So, Jonathan Lethem, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. What a joy.
And this avatar is obviously your essence, I believe.
This is my coming out as a duck. I've been a duck all along, but yeah, you've given my freedom to exhibit the inside of me is now being worn on the outside.
Emmy in the audience says the duck leans in. That's interesting. That ducks are also. You're currently not leaning in, but you may lean in during the conversation. And then next to Jonathan is Joanne McNeil. I talked with here we go. Here's the duck leaning in. I talked with Joanne before, and she actually put this panel together. So big thanks, Joanne. You suggested your friends here, and I think this is really a stellar combination. Joanne is the author of Lurking. Lurking, when the person became the user. Of course, that does not include our Sacred Second Life, where we are still residents. And your book is about the history of social networks, and it's absolutely fascinating. Joanne is a writer, an editor, an essayist. You also were a resident artist at iBeam, which is a Brooklyn art nonprofit. I worked with a person here in Second Life years ago who was from iBeam. So thank you, Joanne. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm so happy it came together. I feel like because we planned this so far in advance, and when we sent the emails out, it felt like December would never come. At least I feel that way. I'm like, I'm making plans on the internet this summer for December, and now it's finally here.
Are you saying we live in a world where the future is so uncertain that we better should not make plans? Is what I'm hearing.
It's just that it felt like a really uncertain time.
Jonathan is looking at his hand because Jonathan is the only fiction author, he's a novelist, and his book is all about the end of the world and what comes after. And he's looking at his hand like, yeah, tell me about it. I want to do a quick round because the common theme is, I guess, the state of digital interaction or online interaction. And I'm going to ask a broad question, but try to be very, very brief. What is wrong with the internet today? What
Oh, that's easy.
Okay, so John is he's leaning in. There you go.
That's easy. Let me handle this. No one else is going to have any need to say anything. I can take care of that. The problem with the internet today is capitalism.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah,
capitalism is good. But capitalism is good for, competition is very good for art, because otherwise nobody will get off the couch. No pun intended, little duck.
You don't want to see me try to get off this couch.
Who said you can't make
Actually,
art?
I really don't.
I think that's what we're doing now.
Capitalism, Jenny, what do you think?
I would agree, and I would say maybe what specifically one of the problems is that it's not very well designed for encounter, which is something that I'm really interested in. My book is what is a genuine encounter with either another person or a piece of art or even information. I feel like, at least in my experience of the internet, like I often feel like I'm lacking agency in the things that I'm sort of like washed over with. Like I didn't make a decision to be shown this ad or to know what this person thinks about something. And it just feels very different for me to, things like wandering through a library or meeting a stranger by chance or things like this.
But then if we're more precise, and you write about this in your book too, it's really more about the specific business model that has become so ubiquitous by these huge behemoth, these monopolies, because there could be a different model. We could envision a different model where people could make an income, but I guess the big problem here is how Google, Facebook, etc., have figured out how they make their money, and it's working for them.
Yeah, I feel like I'm specifically talking about social media in the book, but yeah, like I think a lot of it came out of my experience after the 2016 election of kind of like realizing that I had an abusive relationship with social media, and that like there's this, you know, outpouring of very justified outrage, but that sort of like builds on other outrage, and wasn't really sure like what this was accomplishing, but I knew that it was definitely great for the margins of like Facebook and Twitter. And so like the stuff of just like reaction is great for their bottom line, and sort of also horrible for, I think, our ability to seek nuance and contexts and have the kinds of conversations that proceed in a different kind of timeline, especially, and require more patience. It's like it just so happens that their business model is really detrimental to those kinds of things.
And that's what I wanted to go into, because that's the commonality also, that this business model removes context, and maybe removes in the long term. That's what I'm afraid too, the ability to absorb context, and the willingness to kind of, you know, take the time to look deeper into things. In Claire, would you like to add something? Because you also write about in your book, there's, and in every book, in some fashion, there are stories of really good ideas, and they get commodified really, really quickly. I
Yeah,
have on my
totally.
sheet here in your book, for example, women.com, and I mean a lot of other really, really cool ideas that just get absorbed into the machine. And again, like Jonathan was saying, this seems to be, I mean, it is the modus operandi of capitalism as we know it. It's really not surprising.
Yeah, I think yes. I mean, capitalism is the underlying problem, and one of the consequences of that is this totally unrealistic sense and expectation of scale with social media. I mean, I think a lot of what we sort of fetishize and love about vintage internet is that the signal to noise ratio was just different, and we had the capacity to deal with smaller groups, interest-specific groups, localized groups, groups that we could kind of wrap our heads around and build a real community around, you know, with using the normal mores of community building, you know, doing placemaking together and coming up with, you know, our standards and our culture of our little group. When you try to scale that into the billions, it's just impossible. It's unrealistic to imagine that we can monitor and protect and build online communities that are actually good for the human race if we're thinking at that scale. You know, we have to outsource moderation to all these traumatized contract workers who are bearing the trauma of the entire network, rather than allowing, you know, deputized users who have a real stake in the community to actually build something meaningful. So everything's just too big.
Hmm. And Joanne, you have that same thesis. If I were to summarize your book at the end, your prescription or your take is that global scale, or what these big companies and their investors demand, it's that will never work, basically. And also, and then you also add in your book, which I love in Lurking, is that the internet needs librarians. And actually librarians figure in every one of your books, really. They have a really important part. So yeah, Joanne, I guess you agree with the global scale, but what about
Yeah, I
those
mean,
librarians?
well, I mean, just to add to the idea of scale, all of these big tech companies, they were designed to absorb everyone. And that's just never how humans have socialized. So when you imagine, like, you, of course, like we probably all know the term context collapse, where you're used to seeing your family in this context and your friends in this context and your workmates in this context, and having to negotiate all these people in one space, and also all these strangers. And
Hmm.
some platforms are kind of creating a community, but it's still altered by algorithms. But other platforms like Twitter, you know, you might just post something, just a stray thought, and think it's just going to, you know, most of my tweets, nobody really sees them. So, but every once in a while, one will go super viral, and I'm expecting this conversation with the several people that I'm normally chatting with on Twitter, and then someone else is here and misconstruing the statement, and the sense of having to, it always feels, what it feels like? It's like when you're at like some big party and you're trying to get someone aside to chat with them because it's so loud, but there's just nowhere to go, at least on these platforms. I mean, there are still ways to carve kind of to create community, not doing what the platforms want us to do, but kind of like appropriating these spaces for our own purposes. And so that's what I see as like the main tension today. And what I'd like to see of the internet is more intentional design, sort of like what Jenny was saying. There are a few academics and researchers right now looking into the history of parks and libraries and thinking about public space, and public space never really having a perfect history. I mean, in my book, I really wish I'd been a little bit more deliberate of pulling out, like, libraries have not always been safe spaces for people. Right now, they're about as safe as you can get, but a reminder, this is the world we're in right now. Nothing is perfect. And I'd love to just think of a park as a leisurely stroll and beautiful trees, but the reality is,
What do you mean? You go into a park and then you don't take pictures of the fall and tweet them, and then look at the phone every 30 seconds if it's retweeted? You don't do these kind of things?
well, I might go into the park and take a photo, but I'm a white woman and I'm not going to be bothered by cops in a park. So that's the reality of these spaces, that we don't want to think of any space as super idyllic, because, once you dig into the history, you see some messy histories. So it's really a matter of constantly improving and aiming bigger and aiming for something much better than we've ever had, which would have to be non-commercial and would have to have care for a community in mind.
Mhm. This is also a common theme, really. The loss of public spaces, which again is, and I agree with you guys 100%, which is a natural function of capitalism, which wants to privatize absolutely everything. With the libraries, I want to go to John, because Jonathan, you also have a librarian in your book, and you're, like I said earlier, you're the only novelist here. So you're presenting with your book, The Arrest. You're presenting a vision of a world, a post-apocalyptic dystopian mashup. So that's really brilliant, that you came up with that and you pitched that, because your book is about a Hollywood studio executive in a futuristic flying machine. Can you give me an elevator pitch that you gave to your publisher, what this book is about?
Oh, I would never have been able to do it as a pitch. I just wrote the book, but it's
They let you just write whatever you want.
I was living, Drax, in a town in Maine, in coastal community in rural Maine, sort of like the one that I describe in the book, full of organic farmers and with a kind of unnamed quality of being a little bit of a anarchist utopian zone, just by geography and history and the kind of weird stubbornness of the legacy of the main communities, which are so removed that they are self-legislating. It was a place that I could envision as a kind of pre-post-apocalyptic community of preppers and peak oil people, and also people who might not even know that something had changed because their way of life was so in a way apocalypse ready. And internet signal was kind of scarce, and somehow the goings on in distant places seemed much less.
But there you have it. And see, it's interesting because when I read it in the context of all the other books, what you're describing is a little bit utopian. I mean, then you kind of dissect it, and what is cool that this whole sort of back to the farm, you don't ridicule it, but you don't romanticize it either. But what Joanne was just saying, and Jenny's all about bird watching in her book, which I connected to deeply as well. All these things in your book, they people do that actually. So people kind of live a life that seems on the surface pretty desirable, with public spaces, with everybody contributing to a whole, like a one of those communities that Jenny describes, and that then gets sort of self-destructs because somebody leaves the toilet seat up, I guess. But
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is sort of a pastoral vision, but I'm being the child of the generation of Cold War, post-apocalyptic imagination, and coming from the almost dystopian New York City of the 1970s. The only way I could ever envision my way to this kind of pastoral vision was in the backwards through apocalypse, the way J.G. Ballard or Philip K. Dick will bring you to a vision of an alternative community that's a kind of living in the ruins of technophilic capitalist society. This is also like Ridley Walker or other kind of after the nuclear war visions that are secretly pastoral fantasies, wish fulfillment stories. But I loved what Joanne was saying about the how crucial it is to keep an eye on the imperfection of all these. I'm a great romanticizer of the commons, in my thinking and just in my life and my desires. I romanticize these possibilities for common spaces or gift economies, but they are almost always entrenched in a mixed state, an imperfect state, because they interact with our selfishness and with the presence of sociopaths in our community. And so, I tried to put this into the book too, that that it was always unstable. There's a term from the anarchist writer Hakim Bey, temporary autonomous zones. That these things that we treasure, these places we want to idealize, are kind of unstable contraptions. They flare into existence. So this is also true of the internet that we're nostalgic for. It was a temporary autonomous zone.
And in your book, there's this one character who has done something. You hint at it, what he has done, and he gets removed from the community, in sort of a jail. I don't have this quote from Jenny's book here. I wanted to throw it up as a slide, but she's quoting Peter Thiel, and this is a little bit related to this, because all what we're talking about here today, and I want to also go wrap up the show with possible solutions again, and remind us and end on a positive note. But what you guys are describing, these challenges of spaces being privatized, being commodified, being for sale. Jenny has a through line in her book, which I really love, which is that the tech people always prescribe very apolitical solutions, and in Jenny's How to Do Nothing, which, by the way, is not sitting there and staring at the wall, I guess, right, Jenny? Did I understand your book after all? You criticize these solutions, these sort of apolitical prescriptions, these technocratic prescriptions, as a huge problem. And there's a quote by Peter Thiel. I don't know anybody who really likes him, but he's a big player in Silicon Valley. He was a early PayPal investor, and I'm not going to go deep into his entanglement with big data and even Trump. But he says, in your book, you're quoting him as saying democracy and freedom are incompatible. That's just completely insane. But he just says stuff like that, and then when you look at the internet as we have it now, which is designed by not him, but people who are a little bit like him. And now I forget which book it was that I read, because I read so many books. The Montessori to MIT pipeline. Now, please raise your hand. Who wrote this? Joanne, did you?
Not
Montessori?
me.
Am
I
I
would never say something so rude.
just describing sort of people who design these platforms that we all sort of can't live without? I
Well,
think it was in lurking, but anyway,
it,
I'm all over the place. Take
well,
it
I
where
mean,
you
one
will.
thing I wrote that for is I mean, something that I always try to emphasize about my book is I talk a lot about class in the book because I feel like that's really important, and it's one of those pieces about the internet that gets erased, like this idea that of course users do not have the same power as the developers. We're not all the same. And I've been thinking about this a lot in a different angle, kind of. I'm working on a piece right now that's about like representation of people who work as mechanics in science fiction. And I actually did
Uh-huh.
I don't like to do those what do you call when you're on when you're on Twitter and you're asking for suggestions. I don't like to do that too much because it feels like crowdsourcing your research. But
Oh,
in
I
this
see
case,
when people say, "Hey, Hive
yeah, it's like,
Mind, what
hey,
about
anyone.
this thing?"
Yeah,
Mhm.
but this time I was kind of stumped because I would have figured there would be a lot more examples of mechanics, like actual worker who's a mechanic in science fiction. And something I noticed is a lot of people were recommending people that when I looked them up, their title was engineer or was like technician or it was something very prestigious. And that's where, in my book that it ends with librarian, librarians are not very well paid. They're not well paid. They don't have the prestige of tech workers, at least, and even tech workers. How I slip into this, I'm not including the janitors necessarily, the people who work in the cafeteria. I mean, these are issues that I wanted to bring forth in my book, and it's not the only topic in my book, but it's something that I felt was really crucial. It's just like, who is doing the care work, and how do we respect them? I don't necessarily believe in prestige, but like I want them to I want to highlight their work and appreciate
Yeah,
them.
yeah. If you're just tuning in on Facebook, one of those platforms, or Twitter, the other of those platforms, and the third one, YouTube, you are watching the Second Life Book Club with Jenny Odell, Claire L. Evans, Jonathan Lethem, and Joanne McNeil. And we're talking, the title is, what is the title? Social media, is it good for you? Or what is it good for? And we are taking questions from the audience. There's a lot of stuff here on YouTube. I'm scrolling through it, and also in World. I want to ask, actually, first of all, I threw up a little quote from a little excerpt from Jenny's book, where Mark Zuckerberg is quoted as saying, "You have one identity. The days of you having image for your work friends, for coworkers, and for the other people you know are probably coming to an end pretty quickly." Zuckerberg added that having two identities for yourself is an example of a lack of integrity. I mean, this is one of those quotes where you just roll your eyes, especially here in Second Life, where some people have 500 different avatars, which is just wonderful in terms of expressing yourself. But I wanted to bring Claire in because Claire's book is about women that not a lot of people have heard of or ever, and who are also really, really instrumental in shaping or trying to shape and then have been forgotten, not only in terms of networks, but very early on. So I have a whole bunch of questions for you, Claire, but I wanted to ask you, what was the story that surprised you the most when you researched this book? I mean, there's these early computers. I have all these slides here, which are just enormous, and they were operated by women. Here's a slide, the ENIAC computer, where women were operating this, and the engineers who built the hardware didn't know how to operate it themselves, but these women did. They got very little credit. When you
Yeah,
researched this
totally.
book, what was the story that really kind of surprised you the most?
Well, I don't know about individual stories, but I think, it's always really interesting to think about the ways that we have historically written about technology, which, often tends to be about the physical material impact of a machine, or a network set of machines, or constellation of machines working together in concert. It's very rarely about the actual use of those machines, what people do with them, the kinds of signals that are put into them, the ways that they are animated, who programs them, and what those programs are used for, and then also how users adapt those programs in ingenious and unexpected ways to subvert the intention of the designers. I mean, there's this whole universe of effect that is, to me, so much more interesting and so much more important, actually, at the end of the day, than the actual material construction. So I think my effort with this book was to sort of step outside the kind of classically hardware-oriented, obsession with tech, and start thinking about what we actually do with these things. So, I mean, just to think about, for
But it's
example,
also not, I'm sorry to step in here, but it's also
yeah,
not like you're not concluding with like, okay, men are building hardware
no,
and
of course
women
not.
are building software.
No,
No.
it's interesting though. I mean, historically, you do see a lot of women in the spaces that I think are more oriented towards users, but I don't think that's because of any kind of essentialist or natural tendency towards, being caregivers or whatever. It's mostly about the fact that the aspects of computer science which are oriented towards users have been historically less valued. I mean, I think there's a computer scientist that I interviewed in the process of writing a book named Kathy Marshall, who worked at Xerox PARC in the 80s. And she said that, computer science has always marginalized people who are interested in users. And, that is, as a consequence of that, you see a lot of women, especially in the early history of tech, landing in that space because it's a space where they had room to breathe and they didn't have to have, a specific kind of institutional affiliation or education to start making a real contribution to technology. But I think it's also just still to this day the most undervalued and important part of all of this, how brilliant users actually are. I mean, Joanne gets into this in her book a lot, which is why I love it so much, that we don't talk about how much users are actually contributing, how much users are actually designing the platforms themselves in spite of all the constraints that we are made to work against.
Well,
We have
don't
all
get
these,
me started
yeah.
because obviously I'm not the one being interviewed. I should keep my mouth shut. But if you say something like that, I of course have to point out that Second Life is a $500 billion a year economy that is built by the user or the resident. We still call them residents. They're not users yet. We value them, and by
Yeah,
we I mean
absolutely.
me and the people who work for me and built this room.
Yeah, I think, I
Sorry,
mean, in any kind of real community, virtual or otherwise, people have a stake in
and
their
the duck.
environment. They contribute and they negotiate and renegotiate to determine how things are going to be, what their conventions are going to be, what the sense of public life will be, what the collective identity, and what even like the physical environment around them looks like. And I think that's the best of us. And
Yeah.
it's rare that we see platforms that make space for that, which is why I'm grateful, albeit overwhelmed by Second Life.
We'll get you in just like any good Scientology recruiter. I got it down. I'm putting up another slide here from your book. This is a online magazine called CyberRag, which is cool. So there were like this is the early '90s, right? Where people were discovering the web as a place to do electronic magazines. Jamie Levy was very instrumental. She was possibly not the best business person, but that's not to devalue her contributions. She worked on the Billy Idol. Uh, I think it was a flop. Who cares? I
Yeah.
don't. The Cyberpunk album did the Cyberpunk album actually come with floppy disks?
Yeah, it was the
Billy
first
Idol?
album to come with a floppy disk press
That's
kit.
crazy.
It had to happen. I mean, these sort of transitional technologies before the web, but personal computers are around, so people have floppy drives. I think,
Yeah.
yeah, and this is, kind of related to what we were talking about, but I think it's so interesting to look at these people who made contributions to the web in those early days, and were really thinking about it as a cultural object, and trying to do things. I don't know. I think we often think about people who make major contributions to the web as being, entrepreneurs and people in Silicon Valley who are doing
Yep.
IPOs and building platforms. But really, it's like, people who are making interesting websites and showing what the medium can do, and pushing the medium to help develop it are actually doing a lot of the yeah. To me, that's technology. That's technological innovation, is finding a way
Right.
to publish a zine on floppy disk. I mean, that pushes us forward in much more interesting ways often than building the floppy disk itself.
what is the role of technology in your book, Jonathan? And we have to get to reading soon. Oh my God! Let me say three quick things. So first of all, we have a super special guest in the audience, XOX Voyager, also known as Scavinati, a brilliant artist. And incidentally, I'm working on a short documentary with her right now. I hope that this will come out in February, March. But Scavinati is in the audience, and Scavinati is also in Joanne McNeil's
Yes,
book. I think you talk about
yes, I
cyber
do.
power. Yeah.
Yeah, it was one of those projects that, when I read about it, I'm sure Claire knows this feeling too. There were times in my research I would come across something and be so in awe and wish I could have been there. And that's one that stuck in my mind. It's a beautiful example.
And this was a small intentional community. I mean, small. It was an intentional community that Scavinati put together here in a place called the Palace. And the Palace, and again, this is how ignorant I am. I'm putting up a slide here. The Palace was, I mean, that's a virtual world where you can do all sorts of things, and that just completely flew by me. I don't know why.
The Palace is super
I mean,
interesting. There was a chapter of broadband that I ended up cutting about people doing theater in the Palace in the early
yeah.
90s doing these performances of Waiting for Godot and doing like Godard interpretations inside of the Palace to audiences of other chatters by just changing their avatars and putting on different props on their avatars and doing
That's
theater
what
in real
people do
time,
in
kind of
Second
doing
Life.
street theater in the chat room.
Yeah. Amazing. I want to bring Jenny back in because she dodged my question earlier about the apolitical stuff. Why is that so important? Let me play devil's advocate with Jenny here because your book How to Do Nothing. Why do I have to read this book if I already have my phone in phone jail? I can resist the attention economy by putting my phone, in like a little box or something on Sundays, then go for a walk, meditate a couple of times, and then go on expensive detox thing, right? So I don't have to read your book.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that chapter that the Peter Thiel quote is from, I mean, that's where I'm talking about the kind of escapist impulse, which, to Joanne's earlier point is also involved in class because it's sort of like a question of who can afford to exit a situation. And then often it involves imagining this kind of supposedly apolitical utopia. I mean, in Peter Thiel's case, it was literally a floating island that he was interested in.
Right. He was proposing
That
floating islands. I mean, these libertarians are just completely nuts. I mean, we all know that libertarians are basically 12-year-olds or 17-year-olds who, at the age of 12, their mother said, "You got to clean your room," and they said, "You can't make me." I mean, that's to me that I'm sorry, I needed to throw that in there, but Jenny, that's why I love your book so much because you keep this is really the through line. You remind the reader that all this stuff is in many cases it's very performative and it's very privileged, these detox type things and other sort of measures. And if they're divorced from an understanding of the importance of the political organization, they mean absolutely nothing.
right. And I think, I say at the end of the book, like ironically, I don't think anyone who buys the book really actually wants to do nothing, like full stop. I think that like to me the tragedy is that the thing that keeps bringing someone back to social media is actually a really earnest desire for, connection to other people, but also often, like some kind of justice, right? Or like concern. Like there's so many things to be concerned about. And like it's this like sense of obligation or responsibility and also just
You
wanting
mean
to
you mean
reach out.
connecting? You connecting via a cause? You mean people connect
Yeah.
with?
Yeah. 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 And I think like that's, so you go, I mean, this is my experience, right? It's like you go to the platform and you just end up, you don't get what you were looking for, and you just end up driving the water wheel even more, and sort of adding to that momentum. And so I think, like that chapter in particular, I was kind of like trying to think through like, okay, how do I both like preserve some kind of space for agency and reflection and like the sort of need to like momentarily step away or sort of take like an odd angle on things,
Right.
within my own mind for like versus participation and responsibility, and how do you reconcile those two versus this like, I'm gonna like throw my phone in the ocean and walk away forever, which is just like unreasonable, sort of unfeasible, and like, you know, a lot of people just can't do that, right? Like, I mean, I think about it a lot. Like, I have a work situation where like I can just like, sometimes I can like go somewhere for a day or two, and like most people can't do that. And so just like thinking about those like very real, just kind of life circumstances.
But you can see, this is the one thing that I it's not that I disagree with you, but I think you I thought about, you know, I quit Facebook, and then you make a very good point, you know, that like you just making now, some people need to have these connections for your job, for the job, and all sorts of things. And the question is, how important is that, or how meaningful is that for the sort of the bigger cause if you just quit Facebook? For me, I realized if I quit Facebook, what it has allowed me to do is to do casual conversations. You know, when I walk the dog, I'm a very sort of extrovert person. I get into conversations a lot with people, and then they go like, "Have you seen this on Facebook?" And then this is sort of for me the prompt. And I admit I prepare this a little bit too. I said, "Well, I actually quit Facebook," and then they go, "Really? Why?" And then you know, it's almost like somebody who wants to invite you to Bible study, basically. It opens the door, and you know, I mean, I sometimes I bump into a young person, and I think it gives them a little bit food for thought when I sort of lay it out what the problem is beyond, you know, when I talk about the business model, and I talk about the manipulation and about the democratic process and all this kind of deeper stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I will add that when I was reading Joanne's book and I got to the part about how Facebook is just like, it's just unequivocally terrible, that I think Joanne, I told you this, I like underlined it, and then I like wrote like, yeah, next to it with like many exclamation points. So
it actually made me day because
on.
that chapter was that was the one where my editor was like, okay, you're just kind of ranting. You just need to make it a little bit more.
I love that rant.
And I was just like, okay, I'm going to rant, but I'm also going to be focused. I can do it. So it was just so.
I think you did it.
Let me see how many people are watching this stream on Facebook right now. Oh, cool. Yes,
wait,
John?
I just want to say I'm listening to Jenny, and it's so extraordinary because I completely agree with her that many people feel this as an urgent reality and almost a matter of equity to point out that not everyone can afford to stand away for even a long weekend, you know. And then Jenny introduces with a very qualified and almost apologetic kind of privileged context that she does have this ability to step away, and it's extraordinary because it's true, but it's also it's such an incredible claim that we need to frame it and notice this moment that, you know, the invasion of our privacies, the invasion of our leisure, the invasion of our autonomy by these capacities, obligations, the privileges, technologies that are, you know, offered to us that seem somehow to become it's incredibly fortunate. It's like a first world problem. At the same time, it's really captivity, and it's a very new development in human life that one would be in a position to apologize in a way, the way Jenny just was, for even having the privilege of stepping away.
Mm-hmm. But
yeah,
I completely agree. But also Jenny here writes, because this comes to mind while you were talking, Jonathan, marinating in conventional wisdom. You use this phrase in relation to what is not the platform's fault, but it's re-educating us, because we're compelled to and addicted, which is in this case to me the same thing, to constantly have the obligation, a term that Jonathan just used, to be part of this, right? So stepping, I don't know. I mean, it is. I find it's very dangerous, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, something that I've been really interested in recently. I was having a conversation with a friend about the phenomenon of like the the Instagram or Twitter post that's like, I'm taking a hiatus. Like hey everyone, I'm gonna be gone for 2 weeks, and I'm like, you don't owe anyone that. It's like you don't need to set an out of office reply for the entire world. And but it's like even I feel that like kind of pressure, right? And it's like, I mean, I think
you guys are micro. It's not that you guys are celebrities, but you have an audience, you have a fan base. So this is a different situation. I mean, we all know. I mean, this is not a new, new insight for me. Is that these platforms have also. I mean, Joanne is writing about this too. Have turned us all into these micro celebrities. So we're acting as if we need to do this.
Right, but I think for me, it's just been, it's funny how just sort of habits work, right? Where you kind of, I think something I'm really trying to explore in the book is like when those times when you actually have some latitude that was not visible to you. So it's like, oh, right, like I do have, there is a decision for me to make here about whether or not I'm using this platform. I mean, that's acknowledging the fact that they're designed to be incredibly addictive. So you're up against that. But, for me, it's been like, that's why, I love Bartleby so much. And I talk about Bartleby in the book is like, I would prefer not to, like as an answer. That's not, yes, I will, or no, I won't. It's like, I would prefer not to. It's like, I'm not even going to acknowledge the legitimacy of your question in the first place. And so sort of, right, it's like making a new answer. And so like that's like fighting against something or retreating. There's like this kind of like sideways retreat that I find like very interesting. And that can happen in these really small and momentary ways where it's like, oh, right, like I mean, I can't remember who it was. There's a comedian who has a sketch like on Twitter about like this is what it's like every time someone says they're quitting Twitter, and it's just a bunch of people arguing in a room. And then this one guy's like, hey, everyone, well, I just want to let you know that I've made this decision. And like no one's listening to him. They're just all arguing with each other, like that's kind of how it feels.
I've been told by the producers who one of the producers of this show, Strawberry Linden, I admire her so much because she is a well-known person here in the Second Life community, and for as long as I've known her, for over 10 years, she was able to say in the summer to all her Facebook, Twitter, and everywhere she is, say, hey, I'm taking off, see you guys later. And she was not touching the device once during the summer, where she probably vacationed with her family or wherever she was. And I always admired this. But I digress. The reason why I'm mentioning her is because she also tells me that we're running up against the clock, for crying out loud. So let's read something. This is the book club after all. So what I will do, I will move the book stand to the reader, and randomly chosen who was randomly chosen is Jonathan Lethem here with his book, The Arrest. So I'm positioning so that the duck does not, the duck just has to lean in, because that's all it takes, as we know. Lean in, right? That's what women and ducks and male novelists need to do in order to succeed. Here we go. And let me briefly breeze through some of the great comments here on the various platforms while Jonathan is getting ready. Angel here on YouTube says Instagram has guides, which is their version of Pinterest pins now, and Instagram will also roll out their keywords, as in YouTube keyword research and Google's keyword research next year in February. I don't know what that means for us. Patty says it was just announced that the FTC will try to make Facebook divest WhatsApp and Instagram as a monopoly. So I did not know this. Maybe this is breaking news just now. And here in the local chat, Anne Charnock, who is a wonderful author, I'm a big fan. She's here in the audience. She says, are people looking for more vintage feel internet by using smaller community WhatsApp groups and Slack channels? I think it's all about that scale thing. It's what unites all your books. For me as a reader, Stella here says in the chat, do any of the authors feel that the intense use of the internet these days has contributed to the dehumanizing of us? I think that's what we're talking about, or the objectification, she says. And I think that's what Jenny says with her phrase, the marinating in the conventional wisdom, and sort of just cycling through sort of platitudes, because we need hot takes, hot takes, hot takes, right? I mean, what does let me not get off a tangent, because we have very little time left. Little Duck,
I'm going to read for just a page and a half. So this is
can
the
you set it up? Yes.
yeah. So let me tell you, this is the third chapter of The Arrest, which is the only thing I have to say to set this up is it's the main character in the book. The point of view character is named Journeyman, or he calls himself Journeyman, and he is a survivor of Hollywood who has come to this agrarian, post-apocalyptic pastoral town in Maine where he has no particular job. So he gets to wander around just thinking a lot, mostly about how stupid he was to waste his life
In Hollywood,
not becoming an essential member of a post-apocalyptic community. He's not an organic farmer, and he can't repair tools, or he's not a butcher, he's not a fisherman, he's a script doctor. And they don't need
I was
script
just
doctor.
going to say, because he can exactly. He's very good at script doctoring.
They
and
really
he's
don't
been-
need a script doctor after the apocalypse. So instead, he walks around and he thinks. And so this is him thinking for a page and a half about a thing he calls time averaging. Okay. I think that's all I have to say. Time averaging. That was Journeyman's name for it. Time averaging. It wasn't a complicated idea. A thing that happens when you first lay eyes on someone you've known a long time, but whom you only see intermittently. A thing you do to their faces with your mind. Time averaging could also happen if you knew a child or a teenager, if they were your nephew or niece, say. Time averaging worked like this. You saw them. They appeared shockingly old, or in the case of the child, startlingly grown. You found an instant to wonder, where did the time go? Am I old too? Were they managing the same confusion even as they smiled and said how great you look? Then you'd fix them, repair them in your mind using time averaging. See, your mind held a cache of earlier versions, and you'd merge them to make the person continuous with the earlier rendition. You located their beauty and unspoiledness and smoothed it up into the picture. If the person was truly elderly, you'd recuperate them to a degree. If they were a teenager, you'd find the younger child still lurking in their face. The persons for whom we performed the most remarkable acts of time averaging, Journeyman tended to think, were lovers. Former and present. Of course, lovers and siblings. In his present life, Journeyman found himself time averaging his sister nearly every day, despite the briefness of the intervals. Time averaging wasn't a difficult operation in Journeyman's view. In fact, it was impossible not to perform it. Journeyman supposed it was also a thing done to oneself in the mirror, though this seemed to cheapen the theory. He wasn't interested in mirrors these days. The striking thing wasn't the time averaging itself, but the existence of that tiny interval in which it hadn't yet occurred, that moment where we see things as they are. Journeyman suspected we also did this to the world. It must be the case. Thanks, that's it.
Jonathan, awesome. Big
Great.
round of applause. I'm glad you read that, although I secretly hope that you would read the exchange with Journeyman and his former boss, Peter Toddbaum, who is a prepper at a big Hollywood exec, and he comes in and he waxes about the fact that people who write dystopian fiction secretly want to live in their worlds, secretly revel in that.
Yes.
So
Yeah. He says
I love the
even Kafka wanted to go into the castle.
As a matter of fact, I have this excerpt here. I'll put it up as a slide here real quick.
Oh, that's kind.
Peter
But we have to hear-
Toddbaum.
We have to hear
Wanna
everyone else too. No more reading from me.
Okay, I wanted to be unfair to the others. Who wants to read next? Who wants to read next? Raise your hands. Oh, wait a minute, you can't do that. I will. I
don't
will
know how to do that.
designate. Was that Jenny?
No, but I can go.
Okay, then I'll pick Jenny. Let me move the book. What are you going to read for us?
I'm going to read a little bit about well, to our earlier point, comparison to a library and also just context collapse.
The context
From the last-
collapse and the
from the
importance
last
of libraries. And I'm not going to
Yes,
go on and on about John's thing with the library, because the librarian in his book locks herself into the library and she doesn't let other people in, but that's a different thing.
Oh. Okay, so I guess just to give us a little bit of context, this is in the last chapter where I'm talking about context collapse, which was a concept sort of popularized by Dana Boyd. And it's kind of what it sounds like. It's the idea that, for example, when you tweet something, you don't actually know who your audience is. So you're kind of crafting it to be palatable to the lowest common denominator. And so just in the part right before the part I'm going to read, I was talking about my the phone in my house growing up, which was wired. So it's not a wireless phone. So you had to go to the place in the house.
Landline, kids. Landline.
Yes. Before I got older and started carrying around a heavy black rectangle of potentiality and dread, it worked like this. You thought about the call you needed to make, you went to the phone, made the call, and then you walked away. If you decided you had something more to say, you called back later. Not only that, the interaction was with the one other person you had decided to contact. Even calling someone to chat aimlessly had more intention than many of the ways I communicate now. I feel the same way about libraries, another place where you go with the intention of finding information. In the process of writing this book, I realized that the experience of research is exactly opposite to the way I usually encounter information online. When you research a subject, you make a series of important decisions, not least what it is you want to research, and you make a commitment to spend time finding information that doesn't immediately present itself. You seek out different sources that you understand may be biased for various reasons. The very structure of the library, which I used in chapter 2 as an example of a non-commercial and non-quote productive space, so often under threat of closure, allows for browsing and close attention. Nothing could be more different from the newsfeed, where these aspects of information, provenance, trustworthiness, or what the hell it's even about, are neither internally coherent nor subject to my judgment. Instead, this information throws itself at me in no particular order, auto-playing videos and grabbing you with headlines. And behind the scenes, it's me who's being researched. I think often about how much time and energy we use thinking up things to say that would go over well with a context collapsed crowd, not to mention checking back on how that crowd is responding. This is its own form of research, and when I do it, it feels not only pathetic, but like a waste of energy. What if we spent that energy instead on saying the right things to the right people or person at the right time? What if we spent less time shouting into the void and being washed over with shouting in return, and more time talking in rooms to those for whom our words are intended? Whether it's a real room or a group chat on Signal, or I guess here I would add Second Life, I want to see a restoration of context, a kind of context collection in the face of context collapse. If we have only so much attention to give and only so much time on this earth, we should think about reinfusing our attention and our communication with the intention that they both deserve.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that was lovely.
Thank you, Jenny. This is really lovely. This is such a good book. It really, I mean, you combine so many things that have been sort of marinating in my head, and it's so coherent. But that goes for all of you guys. So let's go through with the next reading. I'm going to put this right over here to the cloud person, Claire Evans, and
My identity is becoming more amorphous by the second.
well, I mean, this is your digital self. This is your essence, possibly, or maybe you're still looking for your essence. But here you can find it, Claire, and it doesn't even cost anything. In the beginning, it doesn't.
Okay,
Just like Scientology.
I'm gonna also read something that is a little bit associated to fetishizing an older piece of technology, and I'm gonna sound like a broken record because it's also about how important I think users are. But it's from the introduction to broadband. When I was younger, I had a Dell. It was a beige box fastened to the internet with a 28.8K modem that screeched with every connection. Its keys were as tall as sugar cubes and slightly concave. The installation occupied the elbow of an L-shaped desk in my bedroom's inner sanctum. Over the years, I laid stickers in geological strata across the white laminate of my desk. Peeled one at a time, they'd have revealed earlier versions of the girl sticking them, like a candy passing through its flavors as it melts in the mouth. A teenage girl's room is a cockpit, an altar, and a womb. It contains her most sacred things, and it holds her as she grows, until eventually it ejects her into the world. The Dell underwent its own changes. It ran every Microsoft operating system from MS-DOS to Windows 95. The DOS era was wonderful. Games on floppy disk, terminal commands. Over time, my monitor's blunt plastic bezel thickened with coats of glitter nail polish and post-it notes. "Get a life," I wrote across the Dell's frame, in Sharpie, in anger, in devotion. When the internet came into my life, it was as though my monitor became a glass gate. It opened to an infinite channel. When the modem stuttered, I would shower it in compliments. "You're such a good modem, and I believe you can do anything." It was my own compulsive folk tradition. I believed then that information, like people, needed support on its journey across the world. In my early years online, I learned how to write HTML, and I built rudimentary websites honoring my favorite bands. I sent passionate emails to estranged summer camp friends. I found answers to the questions I was too shy to ask. I made pen pals I was afraid to meet. I journaled in pocket communities now obsolete. In short, I became myself, enjoying the freedoms the computer afforded me, freedoms both from isolation, shyness, ignorance, and to learn, experiment, discover, and play. I abandoned the Dell when I left for college with a Sony Vaio, one of those tragic interstitial laptop models that will likely populate future museums of technology, with a detachable base that served mostly to heat the tops of my thighs. Like most consumer electronics in the United States, the Dell was likely landfilled, or else dispatched by container ship to China, Malaysia, India, or Kenya, where it was disarticulated like a chicken carcass, cables snipped, guts stripped of valuable metals and ores. Today I think about how the glitter-encrusted monitor must have looked to the underpaid laborers working in a toxic field of unprocessed e-waste who ground my Dell into dust. Even once they've grown obsolete, computers never fully disappear. They only become someone else's problem. Being mass-produced, they form part of our cultural memory. Avatars, like my Dell, of childhood landscapes, or like the Macintosh I never had, of personal computing as a whole. Doubtless this is why we so often consider the history of technology as a row of progressively smarter machines, from Chinese abaci to room-sized cabinets tended by pliant workers, from refrigerators with cathode ray screens to ever smaller incarnations of silicon and plastic, dwindling finally to the familiar handheld pane of glass. Anywhere along the line, it's tempting to eulogize the box, to point to one and say, the people who made this changed the world. To live with a box that connects the world to itself is expansive, life-altering, and even a little magic. But the box itself is still only an object. If not taken to pieces and recycled, it'll poison the earth for millennia, a permanence justifiable only if we believe that what happens before the landfill is worthwhile. Spiritual, even. Computers are built to be turned on, cables are meant to be patched in, and links are made to be clicked. Without the human touch, the current may run, but the signal stops. We animate the thing. We give it meaning, and in that meaning lies its worth. History books celebrate the makers of machines, but it's the users who really change the world. Thanks.
Ah, that was
Awesome.
beautiful.
Thank you.
Okay.
Really, really inspiring. And of course, I need to say the residents, not the users, because we're in Second Life.
Presents
Sorry,
too.
I'm a broken
The
record.
lurkers.
I have to be on brand, Joanne. So what are you what are you going to read for us?
I'm going to read a section that, just as it happens, corresponds really well with what Jenny and Claire read. I'm actually, and Jonathan, I feel like we really synthesized our readings.
Frank Zappa would call this synchronicity. I also want to say for the audience that is watching this, I did not have a picture of the Dell, Claire. So in the back, the slide that is on the big screen here behind us is the CyberVision 2001, which retailed at Montgomery Ward for $399. Programmed to talk, it can play games, teach your children math, or help with your taxes. Now, those were the days. Those were the days. When was that? Do you remember, Claire? Was that
It's
the
the
late
early
70s?
80s. That's the computer that Brenda Laurel used to program fantasy children's tales for, if I believe. Maybe
Amazing.
late 70s then.
Okay, Joanne.
All right. So This is just about what it was like when the iPhone was new. Before the iPhone, people texted from clamshells and chocolate bar approximations, slipshod contraptions that got the job done. In 2005, I picked the slickest device from the T-Mobile online store, which came free with a 2-year commitment. But now I remember that silver Samsung Flip about as well as an old toaster oven. It had a throaty shutter click like a power tool. My hand trembled a little when I pressed a button to take a photo. The badly compressed images looked like maroon fingerprints on a postage stamp-sized screen. I don't think I ever bothered to upload any of the pictures to my computer, but the phone seemed good enough because I didn't think it had to be any better. The iPhone came along just as that contract ended. I wanted one, of course, but I wanted it like a shinier paperweight. It would cost $500 and still another 2-year commitment to send email and place calls and keep papers from blowing off my desk. What? I thought the difference between a clamshell and an iPhone was like the difference between economy or first class, not the difference between two destinations. That autumn, I signed up for a focus group through Craigslist that was organized by a local startup. I walked away with a tiny check and an iPhone as a parting gift. Through several models and multiple contract renewals, it has been in my hand or pocket or tote bag ever since. The tactile quality conjured up feelings of intimacy and trust. I held the iPhone so gently at first, like applying eyeshadows with my fingertips, the lightest touch. What else do people handle with such care? Bodies. I started to go to bed with it. It became a paperweight to rest on a pillow. Then it seamlessly integrated with my daily life, so now I scarcely think of it, the same way I don't think of my fork but what's on my plate. The world isn't elsewhere and far away. It became more immediate through the iPhone. But the world surrounding me in my periphery, meanwhile, was less present, less urgent than what, in the moment, I wondered about. I found myself bumping into strangers more frequently. I grew less likely to notice landmarks in a walk in a new city. I never got bored waiting for a train. I no longer dreaded sitting alone with a drink when a friend was running late. I always had something to do. My focus on the screen could keep the bar vultures at bay. I was never alone. Even when I wasn't using the phone to talk, never alone. There was always this one little window in between my thumbs.
And that's Joanne reading from Lurking. Thank you so much. I remember my first iPhone. I remember my first video iPod, as a matter of fact. So we are out of time, and I wanted to discuss the solution to the problems that I think we agree that we are being consumed by platforms that are often run by big behemoths. And Jenny, with her excerpt, again reiterates that maybe broadcasting to the world is not necessary, to put it mildly. Because we're running out of time for the solution, I do have the solution right here. So the solution of a place for open imagination where people, value context and embodiment and embrace and invest in small communities. That place is, of course, called Second Life, and we're here now. And I trapped you guys in here to prove that. My humor is unbearable. Please run. Now, this was a wonderful, wonderful discussion, and I have to be brief because our producer has to run to the next event. Big thanks. Last quick round. Any last thoughts? Maybe a quick prescription for folks. I know that Jenny is recommending bioregionalism, which I find completely fascinating. But if you had a very quick thing that people could do now, maybe over the holidays, to reflect or to change their behavior, something that is doable and that connects them to people better, and maybe also has a community organizing political component to it. Any magic bullets?
I could add one. Something I think about a lot is that when I was first on the internet as a teenager, I was learning HTML and CSS, but it was until my 30s that I really thought of it as oh, I was coding. I mean, and it's one of those things, like I could have put HTML on my resume, but all this time that I'd been acquiring all these skills just to contact people. And of course, this is 90s internet, very, very different back then. But I would recommend, I feel like the Second Life crowd, the thing that's very cool about the residents is that people are already tinkering around. And I hate that learn to code has become this really aggressive slogan as like, oh, just pull yourself up from your bootstraps. I think of it as you might already code and just play with that and see if that makes you feel a little bit more in control of your situation, or at least like I'm not saying like learn Python or something like that, but just like if you do have skills, own those skills.
Mm-hmm. Come into Second Life and learn Linden scripting language. I just did a profile of Arieto. She's not here right now, but she's a young woman from Mexico City, and she taught herself design and scripting, and she makes wonderful worlds, and she has put together a dance thing up on the 3,000 meter level here on the island. It's what hundreds and thousands of people do, and they do it for hobbies, and some people make an income, but it's not a it's not a requirement. It's you can just tinker without having to broadcast it out. I mean, you could broadcast it out all the time like I do, but I'm also a little bit of a narcissist. Any more prescriptions, or have I?
This is not
Yes?
a magic bullet, but this is something I think about a lot. There's this great interview with William Gibson from the Paris Review from a few years ago where he was talking about how Blade Runner was the first movie to depict the future as it really was, which is not as some kind of shining citadel on a hill, but as something closer to a compost heap where the past and the present and the future are all kind of, disintegrating together and forming this new amorphous thing. And I think it's important to remember that just because something is new doesn't mean it obliterates the old. And in fact, I think the more we invent new ways of being together, the more it sort of activates and makes more complicated and more interesting all the ways in which we are already together. And I think we can pick and choose things that we like from the past and things from the future. We don't have to all be in one place at once. We can exist on multiple levels and take what we like from things and not be totally locked into them, if that makes sense.
Takes
we can
willpower.
think of the internet as a compost pile, is basically what I want to say.
Yep. It takes willpower.
That's terrific. I love that. It's the coexistence. I'm always I was around in the Bay Area in the 80s, and there was this rhetoric of kind of Wired magazine rhetoric of the replacement of nearly everything I loved was about to become virtual reality instead, and it was this insteadness that seemed so so violent, and then I began to notice what the weird, homely, awkward way that the future was coming. It was like suddenly everybody was writing emails, and I said, well, wait a minute, the written language isn't disappearing. It's like the entire world is epistolary novels right now. We're all writing epistolary novels to each other in these endless chat rooms and blogs and stuff. And I love pointing out that you could still find a fax machine in my house, and we still have theater, even though movies and radio, all of these things were supposed to destroy each other. Instead, they just stacked up into this wonderful, weird, index of possibilities, and they continue to inform each other.
Yeah, exactly. The past gives context to the future, and the future can reactivate the past in all kinds of unexpected ways.
Oh, wonderfully put. But nothing will change because Silicon Valley is dominated by used car salesmen, and they need to actually new car salesmen. They need to tell you that your car sucks and you need to buy a new one right now while it lasts. Thank you so much, Jenny Odell, Claire L. Evans, Jonathan Lethem, and Joanne McNeil. Please check out their books. I stress this at the end as we're wrapping. It's very important to support writers by purchasing if you can, or going to the library and getting their books and recommending them if you like them. That's how you keep this art alive. Big thanks to my team, of course, Strawberry and all the others. big thanks to a wonderful audience. Thank you so much. If I didn't get to your question, we have 10 minutes post game. We're going to go upstairs to the dance barn, or we can go to the synthwave place. It doesn't matter. The teleporter is outside. If you meet other people, please befriend them. Strike up a conversation. This is all about community building. As well, for me personally, this is a labor of love. I am a Linden Lab contractor, but this is my thing, where they support me, and it's wonderful to see this community grow. So hang out. If you need to leave. Don't feel obligated, but do hang out. Now, two more things. Before Christmas, we're going to start bring a guest book in here where people can put in recommendations, and also the gallery of all the past guests, which is going to be a huge gallery where you can explore their works, you can get in contact with them. That's all going to be done by the 23rd, so just before Christmas. And then lastly, next week is Jeffrey Ford. Just starting to dive into Jeffrey Ford's work, really cool stuff. And he has been seen in Second Life, so he visits by himself. I don't know, in preparation for the show, so he doesn't fall off the stage, or he may actually enjoy it and found his community. I don't know. But Jeffrey Ford is coming next week, and I will see all of you guys next week, next Wednesday at 12 o'clock on the Second Life